And Samaria maintained a mixed religion, including the building of a temple that remained for several hundred years later. Somewhere around 400, mid-400s BC to about 150 BC, they built a temple on this mountain called Gerizim. There are two mountains, Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, that are kind of like sentinels. To the north is Ebal, to the south is Gerizim, and there's a pass in between where you can get from the Jordan River, which is very, very low, it's below sea level, and you can pass through there and get to the Mediterranean Sea without having to go up and over the mountains. And the two sentinels there are Mount Ebal to the north and Mount Gerizim to the south. And actually, when the Jews came in to inhabit the land, the Levites stood right there in the valley, and half the people went up to Mount Ebal, and half of them went to Mount Gerizim, and they declared the whole law. And when they declared the curses of the law, the people up on Mount Ebal went, Amen! And when they declared the blessings of the law, the people on Mount Gerizim said, Amen! So about 400 BC, the Samaritans, with this mixed up religion, decided, we need a temple. Let's build one. And so they built one on Mount Gerizim. And it was still this mixture of Judaism and everything else, but they thought, well, this is where God's blessing was when the Jews were first brought into the land, so we'll build a temple here and we'll worship. But then when the Greeks came through, they said, well, we'll worship Zeus here in this temple. And they worshiped there until that temple was torn down in around 150 BC. And then, of course, we get into the era of the Roman occupation of Palestine. And we come now to a place in the New Testament. Turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 4. Gospel of John, chapter 4. Gospel of John chapter 4, and we'll start to read at verse 1. John tells us, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples did. Interesting little sidelight. He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. Now let's get our geography straight so that we understand what Palestine looked like in Jesus' day. Judea was essentially the area that comprised the southern kingdom Judah, back in the day that we're talking about, which is about 700 years earlier. Galilee is up to the north, up where the Sea of Galilee is, and so forth. It's up to the north. And in between was this region called Samaria. Samaria. Where we just were in 2 Kings, where all the people had been repopulated and all the religion was so messed up. And notice what happens in verse 4. But he needed to go through Samaria. Pastor Kevin, doesn't sound too amazing. I mean, if Judah's in the south, and that's where he was, Galilee's up in the north, and that's where he wants to go, well, then he'd have to go through Samaria, right? So what's the big deal? The big deal is that during Jesus' day, the Jews who had come back to Jerusalem and were trying to keep hold of the law and keep hold of the covenant, they hated the Samaritans, because they saw them as people who had taken God's covenant and mixed it together with other things, and that they weren't even really Jews. They at best were half-breeds. They at best were somebody who had been left when the Assyrians took everybody out, and they married one of the people that the Assyrians brought in. And so in this day, the Jews hated the Samaritans. And you know what? It went both ways. Samaritans didn't care for the Jews either. And so when a Jew, a good Jew, would travel from Judea up to Galilee, they would head east, cross the Jordan River, then head north, and then go west to get to Galilee, so they didn't even have to walk through Samaria. It's an interesting twist of history that today, if you visit Israel and you are down in Jerusalem and you want to go up to Galilee, more than likely the way you're going to go, you're not going to go straight north. You're not going to go across the Jordan River, because then you would go into Jordan. You could do that. But more than likely, you're going to go, instead of going north, you're going to go west so that you avoid the West Bank, which is essentially where most of Samaria was comprised. If you look at Israel's map today, there's like a 10-mile strip on the western shore of Israel that connects the southern part of the nation of Israel with the northern part. Because the West Bank is not, I always used to think, well, the West Bank is right there, right over there by the Jordan River and a little bit of the bank there. No, it's essentially from the Jordan River to about 10 miles before you get to the Mediterranean Sea. Check a map sometime. That's the way it is. And so when we were in Israel, to get to Israel, you don't want to go through Palestinian-held territories. So you head east and go up and around. It's interesting that you could think of the animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans like the Jews and the Palestinians today. It was that deep-rooted. It had roots that went hundreds of years of animosity. And so instead of being like the good Jews of the day who would avoid getting polluted and go around Samaria, what John tells us is that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. The old King James says it this way. Jesus said, I must needs go through Samaria. Jesus was on a mission to Samaria. He didn't want to avoid it. He went right to it. So what happened when he got there? Well, verse 5, he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well, and it was about the 6th hour, which in modern terms means it was about noon. And a woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. So here he was all by himself, and here comes this woman all by herself. She's getting water out of the well, which was an extremely deep well. The well that is there now, that archaeologists believe is the actual well, is about 75 feet deep, but it has been filled over several times in the centuries since. So, yes, it's a very deep well. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? Not only would a Samaritan not ever, try and go through Samaria, they would never talk to a Samaritan. They would certainly, a man would never talk to a woman. Certainly they would never drink out of the same cup. Did anybody who's been really working hard in some really gross thing or something, and they have a drink and they go, oh, you thirsty? Here. That's what the Jews thought of a Samaritan giving them a cup of water. Oh, no, thank you very much. And so this woman is like, what's the deal? Why do you want... Why are you asking me this? Why would you do this? And Jesus answered and said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Now for us in 21st century America, and if you are familiar with the term living water, you think of it in terms of a spiritual thing. Living water. That's what Jesus gives us. That's what gushes out of your innermost being, according to the Scriptures. But to the people in that day, that's not what the term living water meant. What living water meant was water that came from a stream, as opposed to water that was just in a pool. Living water it's moving. It's alive, it's living. There's probably fishies in there.